A poor widow begged, "Please bury my child." The mountain man's response will shock you. The wind howled down from the snowy ridges of the Montana highlands, carrying the sharp bite of winter. The world was white and gray, dead pines leaning beneath the weight of ice, a frozen creek cutting through the valley like a line of silver glass. Out of that desolate landscape, a lone figure stumbled through the drifts. Her name was Martha Hale, a widow thin as a reed, her shawl little more than rags. She clutched something close to her chest, wrapped in a patchwork quilt, her arms stiff from cold and grief. Every step was agony. Her shoes were worn through, her lips cracked and blue. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Ahead, half hidden among the evergreens, smoke curled from a chimney. A cabin stood there, solid, weathered, the only sign of life in miles. Martha stared at it through blurred vision, hope flickering faintly in her chest. She whispered through trembling lips, "Please, let someone be home." She reached the clearing, her knees giving way. The bundle in her arms shifted, limp and still. She pulled it closer, rocking back and forth though the child no longer breathed. Through the haze of her tears, she saw a man emerge from behind the cabin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, bearded, dressed in worn buckskin and fur. His hat shadowed most of his face, but his eyes, gray as the storm, watched her cautiously. He was Eli Boone, the mountain man the nearby town whispered about. A man who'd turned his back on the world after losing everything. Eli's axe hung loosely in his hand as he studied the broken woman before him. The forest fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Martha tried to stand but collapsed again, her body trembling violently. "Please," she rasped, her voice hoarse from crying and cold. "Please, sir. I need you to bury my child." Her words cracked in the air like glass. Eli blinked, lowering his axe. He looked from her face to the bundle she clutched, and the truth struck him like a bullet. The woman's fingers trembled as she loosened the quilt, revealing a pale, lifeless boy, no older than 6. His small hands were curled as if he were still clutching a dream. I tried to make it to town," she stammered. "But the storm came, the trail disappeared, and he just went quiet in my arms." Eli said nothing. He stood rooted to the spot, his breath coming in heavy clouds. The sight of the dead child dredged up memories he'd buried deep. His own little girl years ago who had taken fever while he was away trapping in the high country. He'd returned to find her grave already cold. Now here was another mother, alone with her grief, asking him for something no one should ever have to ask. Finally he moved. He set the axe down slowly, stepped forward, and knelt beside her. His voice when it came was low and rough. "Ma'am," he said, "you can't stay out here. The cold'll finish you too." She shook her head weakly. "Please just bury him. I don't need nothing else." Eli looked at her, truly looked. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, her shoes torn open. She had walked through a blizzard with her dead son in her arms. Something stirred inside him, a flicker of mercy long thought dead. He reached out and placed his rough, calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "Come inside. We'll see to him proper." Martha looked up, uncertain, as if afraid he might vanish if she blinked. Then she nodded faintly. He lifted her by the arm, careful as if she might shatter, and helped her through the snow toward the cabin. The door creaked open, the warmth of the fire spilling out across her frozen skin. Eli took the small bundle from her trembling hands, holding it with reverence. He laid it on a table covered with an old wool blanket, removed his hat, and stood silently. For a long while neither spoke. Only the crackle of fire filled the cabin. Martha sank into a chair, her body shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her eyes drifted to the wooden floor, to the motionless form of her boy. "I promised him I'd keep him safe," she whispered. "I promised?" Eli's jaw tightened. He swallowed hard, then spoke softly. "You did what you could, ma'am. The mountain don't show mercy, but you got him this far. That counts for something." He poured her a tin cup of hot water, placing it in her hands. As she sipped, her body began to thaw, and with it, the full weight of her loss settled in. The firelight flickered across Eli's face as he turned toward the table. His eyes lingered on the still child's hand, small and delicate, curled near the edge of the quilt. Something inside him cracked open. The pain he'd buried under years of solitude came flooding back. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were wet with unshed tears. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'll dig the grave myself." Martha looked up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. Eli gave a small nod, his voice deep and sure. "We'll give the boy a resting place the mountains won't forget. Outside, the storm howled again, but inside that cabin for the first time in years the cold began to lift. The cabin's fire crackled softly, its light flickering over rough-hewn logs and the iron tools that lined the walls. The storm raged outside, pounding against the roof, but inside there was a fragile stillness, a silence heavy with grief. Eli Boone set another log on the fire, sparks leaping as the flames caught. He moved with quiet purpose, every motion deliberate. The widow sat near the hearth, her shawl drying over her shoulders, her eyes empty and distant. On the far side of the room, the small bundle lay on the table, covered now with Eli's only clean blanket. He'd folded it carefully over the child's face, his rough hands trembling for the first time in years. Eli wasn't a man used to company. His life in the mountains was one of solitude, trapping, hunting, mending, surviving. Yet something about the frail woman sitting before him stirred a memory too painful to name. He poured a cup of hot tea, nothing fancy, just boiled water with a pinch of pine needles, and set it in front of her. "Drink that," he said gently. "It'll warm you some." Martha hesitated before taking it. Her fingers brushed his as she did, and he noticed how cold she still was. She sipped slowly, eyes never leaving the small form on the table. After a long silence, Eli spoke again. "You from down the valley?" She nodded faintly. "A place called Hollow Bend. Or what's left of it." He grunted softly. "Heard tell the fever hit that way." Her voice cracked. "Took my husband first. Then the crops failed. I sold near everything I had just to keep Thomas fed. When the snows came I tried to leave, head for the mission in Helena. But," her throat tightened and she couldn't finish. Eli nodded slowly. He didn't press her. He knew what it was to lose, to have the world stripped down until there's nothing left but breath and sorrow. The fire popped. Shadows danced across the walls. After a while, he said quietly, "Name was Thomas, you said?" She nodded. "He was 6. Eli got up without another word and rummaged through an old chest by the door. From it he took out a small wooden cross, hand-carved and smooth from age. It was simple but made with care. He turned it over in his hands before setting it gently beside her on the table. "Made that years ago," he murmured. "Didn't have reason to use it. Till now." Martha reached out, tracing the carved lines with her trembling fingers. The gesture undid her completely. She broke into sobs, quiet at first, then racking, desperate sounds that filled the cabin. Eli stood frozen for a long moment, then stepped closer and laid a hand on her shoulder. His voice was low, gravelly but kind. "Cry, ma'am. Don't hold it in. The mountain's big enough to carry it for you." Her tears fell freely now, and though Eli said no more, his eyes glistened in the firelight. When she finally quieted, exhausted, he spoke again. "You'll stay here tonight. Too cold to go anywhere. I'll make you a bed by the fire." Martha tried to protest weakly. "I can't take your space, mister. You've done enough already." Eli shook his head. "Ain't no trouble. Cabin stood empty too long anyway." He gathered furs and blankets, spreading them near the hearth. Martha sank into them, the warmth seeping through her bones. For a while, she watched him move around the cabin, tending to chores he didn't really need to do, checking traps, stacking wood, cleaning a rifle. She realized he was trying to keep his hands busy, his mind away from the sorrow that hung heavy in the air. When the wind outside died down for a moment, she whispered softly, "You live up here all alone?" Eli paused, then nodded. "Ain't been anyone around for a long while." She hesitated, then asked, "Why?" He stared at the fire, his jaw tightening. "World's quieter up here. Don't ask questions. Don't take things away." Something in his tone told her there was more behind those words, years of pain and loss buried beneath layers of silence. Martha lowered her eyes. Silence can be heavy too. He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had walked through a storm to bury her child, who spoke with the kind of quiet strength only suffering can give. Finally he said, "Yeah, it surely can." The wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. The firelight flickered across the child's still form, and both of them turned toward it. Eli took off his hat and stood solemnly for a moment. Then he spoke in a voice deep and steady. "Rest now, little one. Ain't no cold where you're going. Martha closed her eyes, whispering a trembling prayer under her breath. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew wilder, but within those 4 wooden walls, something fragile had begun to stir. Not love, not yet. But understanding. The quiet recognition between 2 souls who had both lost everything, yet still found themselves alive. Eli sat in his chair, watching the flames, his rifle resting across his knees. Martha slept by the fire, her breathing soft and even. And for the first time in years the mountain man did not feel entirely alone. Morning broke slow and pale over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving the world silent and white. Snow weighed heavy on the pines, and the air was so still that even the breath from the horses miles away might have echoed through the trees. Eli Boone stood in the doorway of his cabin, the bitter air biting at his skin. He looked out across the clearing, cold earth hard as stone, and sighed deeply. He knew what had to be done. Inside, the widow Martha sat near the fire, her face hollow but composed. The night's warmth had done little to heal the ache inside her. Her eyes were red from weeping, but her tears were spent now. What remained was something quieter, heavier: acceptance. Eli spoke softly. Grounds froze deep. Gonna take time to dig. Martha looked up, her voice barely a whisper. I can help. He shook his head. You've done enough. Let me do this. She didn't argue. She only pulled the small wooden cross close to her chest, as if drawing strength from it. Eli stepped outside, shovel in hand. The cold hit him like a wall. His boots crunched through the crusted snow as he trudged toward the edge of the clearing, a place where the trees opened up just enough for sunlight to fall. It seemed right somehow. Peaceful. He drove the shovel into the earth. Clang. The frozen ground resisted him, unyielding as stone. He drove it in again, grunting with the effort. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold. Each thrust was a struggle, each clatter of metal against ice a reminder of how cruel the world could be. Time passed. The wind picked up again, swirling the snow around him in ghostly shapes. But Eli kept digging, his breath harsh and steady. Inside the cabin, Martha watched from the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. With every shovelful of earth he lifted, her heart ached. She wanted to help, to move, to do something, but her body felt like lead. Finally she rose. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she stepped out into the cold. When Eli saw her coming, he straightened, wiping his brow with a gloved hand. You ought to stay inside, ma'am, he said, voice rough but kind. She shook her head. He was my son. I can't stay by the fire while you dig alone. He didn't argue again. Instead, he nodded and stepped aside as she knelt beside the half-dug grave. Her hands brushed the snow away, tracing the earth as if trying to memorize it. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the shovel and the whisper of wind through the pines. When the grave was finally deep enough, Eli set the shovel aside and stood still, breathing hard. Martha unwrapped the quilt she had carried all the way through the storm. Inside was the boy, small, peaceful, untouched by the cold now. Her breath hitched as she looked down at him. He loved the mountains, she whispered. Used to say he wanted to climb him someday. Eli's throat tightened. He looked at the child's face, soft, innocent and heartbreakingly still, and something inside him broke open again. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice low but steady. We'll give him a resting place that looks out over all the peaks. That way he can still see the sky. Martha smiled faintly through her tears. He'd like that. They laid the boy gently into the earth. Martha placed a small toy horse beside him, a whittled figure, rough and chipped from years of play. Then, without thinking, Eli knelt beside her. He took off his hat, bowed his head and began to speak, not like a man reciting a prayer, but like a man talking to someone he hoped was listening. Lord, he said, his deep voice trembling, this here's Thomas Hale. He was brave for his mama right up, till the end. If you got room for a good-hearted boy, take him in gentle. And if you got a bit of mercy left, send some down for his ma too. She's carried a mighty load. Martha's lips quivered as she whispered, and they filled the grave together, slowly, reverently. When the last of the earth was patted down, Eli pressed the wooden cross into the snow at the head. He stood back, breathing hard, watching the wind lift the snowflakes around it like tiny angels. Martha knelt one last time, pressing her palm to the fresh mound. Sleep now, my darling, she murmured. Mama's here. Eli turned away, swallowing the ache that rose in his throat. He'd buried his own family long ago, but this act of kindness, this simple human duty, felt like redemption. As they walked back to the cabin, the sun broke weakly through the clouds, spilling light across the grave. Martha noticed it first and stopped. Look, she said softly. Eli turned. The snow glittered like diamonds over the mound, the wooden cross standing tall. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Eli said quietly, Reckon heaven's already got him. Martha nodded, tears glinting in her lashes. Then maybe heaven's closer than we think. They returned to the cabin in silence, their hearts heavy but not hopeless. The fire inside awaited them, warm and alive. And though grief still clung to the air, something else had entered with them too. Something like peace. The night came quiet and deep over the mountains. The wind had softened, the snow stopped falling, and the forest around the cabin was still as a prayer. Inside, the fire burned bright, steady, warm, alive. Its orange glow flickered across the wooden walls, dancing on the tools, the rifle, and the rough-hewn table where 2 cups of tea sat untouched. Martha sat in the old rocking chair near the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red from the day's sorrow. But there was a kind of calm now, an emptiness that comes only after tears have run dry. Eli Boone moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, though his shoulders seemed heavier than usual. He poured stew into 2 bowls and set one beside her. "Eat a little, ma'am," he said gently. "You need strength." She nodded, though she barely lifted the spoon. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the faint moonlight gleamed off the snow-covered grave just visible through the pines. After a while she spoke, her voice low and tired. "I don't rightly know how to thank you, Mr. Boone. You did for me what no one else would." Eli paused, leaning against the mantel. The firelight caught the lines in his weathered face, the scars of years spent fighting the wild and himself. "You don't owe me a thing, ma'am." "Not one thing," he said. Martha looked up at him then, really looked at him. Most folks would not have stopped, let alone dig a grave in frozen ground. Eli's eyes flickered toward the flames. "Maybe not. But I ain't most folks." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You've buried someone before." The words hung in the air between them, soft but sharp. Eli didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. He stared into the fire, the orange light reflecting in his gray eyes. Finally he said quietly, "A long time ago." Martha waited. She didn't press him. She just watched the fire, letting the silence stretch until he chose to fill it. Eli set down his bowl and rubbed a hand over his face. His voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "I had a wife, and a little girl, Lydia. She was 6, same as your boy." Martha's breath caught softly. He continued, the words coming slow, each one heavy. "Was trapping up north when the fever hit. Took me near 2 weeks to get back. Snow was high, trails near gone. When I made it home, the house was empty. Just a neighbor waiting with 2 crosses in the ground. The room felt utterly still. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackle." Eli swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the flames. "I blamed the world, the town, God, mostly myself. Left everything behind. Been up here ever since." Martha's eyes filled again, not with fresh grief but with understanding. "You thought if you stayed away from people you couldn't lose no one again," she said softly. He looked at her then, surprised she'd said it so plain. "Something like that," he admitted. "The mountain don't talk back. Don't judge. Don't break your heart." Martha gave a faint, trembling smile. "But it don't heal it either, does it?" Eli's lips twitched, almost into a smile, but the pain behind it lingered. "No, ma'am. It surely don't." For a long time neither spoke. The firelight danced between them, warm against the chill that had settled in both their souls. Martha took a small sip of her stew, the warmth filling her stomach. She glanced again toward the window. "I used to think I'd buried everything worth living for," she whispered. "But today when you helped me, I realized kindness still exists. I thought the world had forgotten it." Eli looked up slowly. "Maybe it was waitin' for you to remind it." That drew a faint laugh from her, a sound so soft and fragile it almost didn't make it across the firelight. For a moment they sat in silence again. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind anymore. It was gentle, like the pause after a hymn, when the echo still lingers in the air. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unfinished carving. It was the shape of a bird, rough, unpainted, halfway done. "Started making this for my girl once," he said, turning it in his calloused hand. "Never finished." Martha's eyes softened. "It's beautiful." He looked at the carving, then back at her. "Maybe I'll finish it now. For the boy." Her throat tightened as she whispered, "He'd like that." Eli nodded, then tossed another log onto the fire. The flames roared up bright and steady. "Fire's been burnin' all day," he said almost to himself. "Funny thing about it, it don't care how cold the world gets. You just keep feeding it and it stays alive." Martha looked at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Maybe that's what we're supposed to do too." He met her gaze for a long moment, 2 weary souls sitting in the middle of nowhere, each carrying grief the other somehow understood. Outside, the moon climbed higher, washing the mountains in silver light. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, and for the first time in years Eli Boone didn't feel haunted by the past. The fire that had once been his only companion now burned for two. The days passed quietly in the mountains. Snow melted into rivulets that trickled down the slopes, then froze again each night as the wind shifted. For a short while, it seemed peace had finally settled over Eli Boone's cabin. Martha helped where she could, mending torn fabric, sweeping the floor, boiling water. She spoke little, but her presence softened the place. Her gentle hands and quiet humming made Eli realize how long it had been since laughter or warmth had lived under his roof. Some nights, they sat by the fire without a word, the silence no longer sharp but soothing. Martha would stare into the flames and Eli would watch her, not out of desire but out of quiet awe. She'd endured pain that would have broken most souls, yet somehow she still carried light. But peace in the mountains was always borrowed. On the fourth night after the burial, the wind changed. Clouds gathered thick and fast over the ridge, swallowing the stars. By morning the sky was a wall of gray, and the smell of snow hung heavy in the air. Eli stepped outside to fetch wood, his breath turning white in the cold. He glanced toward the horizon, storm clouds rolling down like an army. "Blizzard's comin'," he muttered. Inside, Martha shivered as a draft slipped under the door. "Will it be bad?" Eli frowned. "Bad enough. You stay close to the fire. I'll board the windows." He worked fast, hammering planks and stacking logs by the hearth. By sundown the storm had arrived. It came howling through the pines, slamming against the cabin like a wild beast. Snow swirled so thick you couldn't see the trees 10 feet away. The cabin shook with every gust. The fire flickered low and Martha huddled near it, her shawl drawn tight. Hours passed. The wind screamed through the night. Then, without warning, Martha began to cough. At first it was soft, just a dry rasp. But soon it deepened, rattling her chest. She pressed a hand to her mouth, pale and trembling. Eli turned from the window, alarm flashing in his eyes. "You all right, ma'am?" She tried to nod, but the coughing took her again. It's nothing," she gasped, "just the cold." He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her forehead. She was burning up. "Fever?" he muttered. "Damn it." He threw more wood into the fire, grabbed blankets and wrapped them around her shoulders. "You lie down now. Don't argue." Martha obeyed weakly, her body trembling as she lay near the hearth. Eli moved quickly, boiling water, mixing herbs, wringing cloths. His hands shook as he worked. He hadn't cared for anyone since his wife and daughter died. The memories came rushing back, the helplessness, the fear, the sound of coughing that wouldn't stop. He pressed the wet cloth to Martha's forehead, whispering, "Not again, not this time." The wind screamed outside, but inside it was another kind of storm. Martha tossed and turned, muttering through fevered dreams. Sometimes she called out for her son, "Thomas, stay close to Mama." And Eli would grip her hand tighter, his own heart breaking. Through the long night, he never left her side. When the fire died low, he fed it. When her fever spiked, he cooled her brow. When she whimpered in pain, he whispered steady words to anchor her. "Breathe, ma'am. You hear me? You're safe. Ain't no mountain taking you now." At one point, her eyes fluttered open. In the flickering firelight, she looked at him as if seeing through the fog of fever. "You buried my boy," she whispered, her lips trembling. "You don't owe me nothing, Eli Boone." He shook his head fiercely. "That's where you're wrong." Her brow furrowed weakly. "Why?" He swallowed, voice low and raw. "Because helping you, keeping you alive, it's the first thing that's made sense to me in 10 damn years." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She gave a faint, trembling smile before slipping back into sleep. Eli stayed awake until dawn. The blizzard raged, but he didn't hear it anymore. He sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering to a God he hadn't spoken to since his family died. "Don't take her," he murmured hoarsely. "You already took enough from me. Let her live. She's got more fight in her than I ever did." When morning came, the storm broke. The world outside lay buried in silence, thick snow, no tracks, no wind. The first light of dawn spilled through the frosted window, faint and silver. Eli turned toward the fire, exhausted. Then he saw her. Martha's breathing had steadied. The fever had broken. Her skin, pale and clammy through the night, now held a touch of color. He exhaled shakily, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. Hours later, Martha stirred, her eyes opening slowly. The first thing she saw was Eli, head bowed, fast asleep in his chair beside her, still holding her hand. She smiled faintly. Her voice came soft, almost a whisper. "You buried my child," she said, But you saved me. Eli woke, blinking. He looked at her, disbelief and relief washing over him. You're still here. She smiled weakly. Looks like the Lord heard you. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded, voice thick with emotion. Reckon maybe he did. Outside the storm was gone. The mountains stood still and white, glistening under the sun. Inside, in that small cabin where death had once lingered, life had returned, fragile, quiet, but real. And for Eli Boone, it felt like the first sunrise after a lifetime of darkness. The blizzard had passed, but its memory lingered, white drifts piled high around the cabin, and icicles hanging from the eaves like crystal daggers. Inside, the world had changed. Martha's fever had broken days ago, and she was gaining strength little by little. Her voice was still soft, her hands still fragile, but her eyes, they had life again. Eli Boone moved about quietly, chopping wood, melting snow for water, tending to her with the same quiet devotion he once gave his wife long ago. Only this time, something inside him was different. He found himself listening for her voice, waiting for her smile, feeling peace where grief once roamed. One morning, as pale sunlight slipped through the frosted window, Martha sat up in bed, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Eli brought her a tin cup of hot broth. She took it carefully, her hands trembling less than before. You've been good to me, Mr. Boone, she said softly. More than I deserve. He shook his head, setting down the pot. Ain't nobody undeservin' of kindness, ma'am. She smiled faintly. I'm not used to it anymore. Eli paused, his weathered face softening. World's been cruel to both of us, I reckon. But maybe it don't have to stay that way. She looked up at him then, really looked. His hair had grown long, streaked with silver. His beard was thick, his eyes deep-set and tired but kind. There was a steadiness in him, something the world couldn't break. I can't repay you, she whispered. He shrugged, turning toward the window. Didn't ask for pay. You needed a hand. I just did what I could. But deep down the truth ran deeper. Eli didn't help her out of pity. He helped because she reminded him of something he'd lost long ago, purpose. As winter faded, the snow began to recede. Patches of green poked through the thaw, and the first sound of rushing water echoed down the valley. Birds returned to the trees, singing into the crisp air. Spring was coming. And with it came a question that neither dared to speak. What now? A cabin of two shadows. By late March, Martha was walking on her own again. She'd step outside each morning, standing beneath the tall pines, breathing the scent of earth and pine needles. Sometimes she'd talk to her son, buried beneath the oak near the stream. Eli often watched from a distance, hat in hand, giving her space. But each time she'd turn back and smile at him, a silent thank you that said more than words could. At night she helped him cook and mend old gear. They shared quiet suppers by the fire, trading small stories, her life on the plains, his years in the wilderness. Sometimes they'd laugh. Other times, the silence between them was thick with something neither wanted to name. One evening, as rain drummed softly against the roof, Martha set down her sewing needle. The snow's melting fast, she said. I'll be able to travel soon. Eli froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Travel? She nodded gently. I've got a sister down in Helena. I should find her. Start over. He stared into the fire, his heart heavy but his face unreadable. Reckon that's best for you, he said after a moment. But his voice betrayed him, quiet, rough, strained. Martha lowered her eyes. I didn't mean to burden you this long. Eli stood, walking to the window. The storm outside was light, the kind that came before spring truly bloomed. He watched the droplets slide down the glass, his reflection faint in the pane. You ain't been a burden, he said finally. Truth is, this cabin's been too quiet for too many years. You brought something back I thought I'd lost. She looked up, her breath catching. What's that? Life, he said simply. The word hung in the air between them, small but powerful. A seed of something new. That night, neither of them slept much. Martha lay awake, staring into the faint orange glow of the dying fire. She thought of her boy, his laughter, his tiny hands. She thought of how Eli had carried him through the snow without complaint, how he'd risked his own life for a stranger. And she thought of how, even in her grief, she'd found warmth again, the kind that came not from the fire, but from the quiet presence of a man who'd also known loss. In the other room, Eli sat by the window watching the moon rise over the peaks. He'd lived his whole life running from people, running from pain. But now, with her here, silence didn't feel so empty anymore. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden bird, something he'd whittled years ago for his daughter. He turned it in his hand, then looked toward Martha's closed door. The ache in his chest wasn't grief this time. It was fear of feeling again. The morning decision. When dawn came, the sky was clear and pink. The snow had melted enough for travel. Martha stood by the door, her bundle packed. Eli saddled his horse in silence, his every movement deliberate, heavy. When he came back, she was waiting with tears in her eyes. "I'll never forget what you did for me," she whispered. "Or for my son." He nodded slowly, voice low. "You take care of yourself out there. This world ain't gentle." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Neither are you," she said softly, smiling through tears. "But you've got the gentlest heart I've ever known." For a long moment they stood there, two broken souls, bound by what they'd survived. Then she turned, stepping into the sunlight. Eli watched her walk down the trail until the trees swallowed her. He stood there long after she was gone, hat in hand, the wind moving through his hair. Spring had come. But for the first time in years he wasn't sure if the mountain felt like home anymore. Weeks turned into months. Spring gave way to summer, and the high country came alive again. Streams ran clear and fast, flowers spread across the meadows, and elk roamed the slopes like quiet ghosts. Eli Boone still lived in his cabin beneath the ridge, but it wasn't the same. Each morning he'd step outside to the sound of wind in the pines and look toward the old trail that cut through the valley, the one she'd taken when she left. He told himself he wasn't waiting. But his heart said otherwise. He busied himself with work, mending fences, trapping, hunting, repairing the roof before autumn came again. Yet even in the thick of labor, her voice haunted him. The way she said his name, the softness of her eyes when she smiled, the way she'd whisper to her son's grave before dusk. The cabin that once felt peaceful now felt hollow. Sometimes at night he'd take out the small wooden bird, the one he'd carved for his daughter, and hold it close. "Maybe you were right," he'd whisper to the shadows. "Maybe I weren't meant to live alone forever." But the mountains don't answer. They only echo. The stranger on the trail. It was near the end of July when Eli spotted smoke curling from beyond the pines. No one traveled that deep into the valley, not unless they were lost or desperate. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and made his way down the trail. The forest was still, except for the murmur of the creek. Then he saw it, a wagon half broken, its wheels stuck in the mud. A small campfire burned beside it. And there, kneeling in the dirt, was a woman in a faded bonnet. Eli froze. His breath caught. "Martha." She turned slowly. Her eyes widened, tired but warm, disbelieving. "Eli." He stepped closer, his voice rough with surprise. "What in the blazes? I thought you was halfway to Helena by now." She gave a soft, weary smile. "I tried. Made it near halfway before I realized I didn't belong there anymore." He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Her voice broke as she spoke. "My sister, she'd moved on. Had a family, a life. There wasn't room for a widow still grieving. Every place I went, I felt like a ghost. But up here," she paused, looking at him through tears, "up here I felt alive. For the first time since Thomas died." Eli's throat tightened. "You came all this way alone?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. "A trader gave me a lift part of the way. The rest I walked." He took a deep breath, stepping closer. "Why?" Her answer was simple. "Because I wanted to come home. A heart found in the wilderness." He didn't speak. Couldn't. He just stared at her, mud-streaked, tired, trembling, and yet she looked stronger than ever. Finally he broke the silence. "You ain't got to ask twice. Let's get you back to the cabin." He lifted her pack, set it on his shoulder, and helped her fix the wagon enough to move it closer to camp. As they walked, the old quiet between them returned, not empty but full of meaning. When they reached the cabin, Martha stopped in the doorway, her eyes glistening. "I never thought I'd see this place again." Eli smiled softly. "Reckon it waited for you." Inside, everything was as she'd left it. Her shawl still hung on the chair. The little cross she'd carved from wood for her boy rested on the mantel. She walked over and touched it gently, whispering a prayer under her breath. Eli stood a few steps behind, hat in hand. "I kept it just how it was," he said quietly. "Didn't have the heart to move it." Tears welled in her eyes. She turned to him. "You kept his grave too?" He nodded. "Every morning. Cleared the snow through winter, planted wildflowers in spring. Seemed the least I could do." That was it. The last wall between them crumbled. Martha crossed the room and took his rough, calloused hands in hers. "Eli Boone," she said, her voice trembling, "you gave a mother back her faith when she had nothing left to live for." He swallowed hard. And you gave an old fool a reason to hope again. They stood there, the firelight soft on their faces, silence stretching. Not from uncertainty but from understanding. Finally Martha whispered, "Then maybe we stop runnin' from the past. Maybe we start livin' for what's left." Eli nodded, eyes glistening. "I'd like that, ma'am. I surely would." A new dawn over the ridge. That night, for the first time in years, laughter returned to the mountain cabin. The fire crackled, the wind hummed low through the trees, and two souls who had once been strangers shared warmth, stories, and quiet peace. When dawn broke over the ridge, Eli stepped outside. The air was crisp, golden light spilling over the peaks. Martha joined him, her shawl pulled tight, her hand brushing his. He looked down at her, a small smile touching his lips. "You sure you're ready to spend another winter up here?" She smiled back. "If it's with you, Eli Boone, I reckon I could face any storm." He chuckled, his voice low. "Then I'll make sure there's always a fire waitin'. Together they stood, watching the sunrise over the valley, a world reborn from grief and loss, warmed again by love and grace. And beneath the old oak by the stream, where a child slept beneath wildflowers, the wind carried the faintest sound, soft and peaceful, like the sigh of a spirit finally at rest. He buried her child with honor, but what he gave her was something greater, a reason to live again. And up there in the silent mountains, the poor widow and the mountain man found what both thought they'd lost forever, home.